are continuing this collection of messages today that we have kind of designed and built around this whole thing. And this series has been called Faith Forward because we've been looking forward at the next season for our lives in faith. That we cannot look forward without faith, right? And my hope and my prayer over the last month has been that you would see more outside of what we talk about on Sunday morning than just a building project. I don't look at the next season of our life and say, okay, this is simply about raising money, because that's not what this is all about. My goal is that you would see a growth in not only your church, this is your church, but you would see growth in your family, that you would see growth in your relationships, your friendships, your marriage, your workplace, that there is a next season that you are looking forward to in faith. I truly believe that God is going to do something great in the next series or next season that we step into. Kids are loud today, right? Yeah, Corey went in there and he's all like, the adults are doing this competition, and that's what's happening over there. Don't tell Corey I made fun of him. I'm just joking. I love Corey. Is Corey here? I really think that we're taking strides in our life to be better. And if we're not taking strides to step out in faith, to be better in our walk with Christ, to be better in our relationship with Jesus, then at best we're standing still and we're stagnant. At the very worst, we're taking steps backwards and we're digressing our relationship with God. And if we're moving back, what in the world is the point of any of this? Right? What's the point of us showing up on a Sunday? What's the point of us doing, a night of worship or kids events or whatever if we're not willing to move forward in our relationship with God? Last week we talked about generosity and the act of giving, and it was a very practical message. It was very external focused. Today I want to go in a different direction. I want to take something from the internal aspect. I believe that generosity and giving starts on the inside, but there is a physical act that we have to take part in. So I want to go in a little bit of a different direction. There is a motion that has to occur for faith to work. There is something that has to occur for faith to work. We won't ever be able to effectively step out and step forward in faith until we become broken. We have to become broken before we can move out into faith. This past week, I plugged in an old external hard drive into my computer, and I was flipping through these old files and these old videos, and I came across the video of the first series that I preached here at the church about 2.5 years ago. And I was watching it, and it was excruciating to watch. Not because it was bad, it was remarkable. I laughed, I cried a little, it was great, super powerful. Aesthetically, it was not super pleasing. And then also, some of you might remember when I first showed up at the church, I was in recovery from this surgery, and you could literally draw a line down the center of my face. And everything to the right side of that line didn't work. The surgery paralyzed the right side of my face. And I'm watching this video, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is difficult to look at. This was tough, right? And then I had this thought that throughout this whole recovery process, I would always tell Shayna that my face is broken. And it was so hard for me because my face was broken. And post this surgery, I just felt broken. But I had this realization that came out of it, this new understanding. I learned something incredibly valuable for my life. That brokenness creates vulnerability, and vulnerability creates desperation. And in the desperation is when God chooses to use us. God has the ability to use us when we're broken. We've been looking at these interactions that Jesus had throughout the Gospels over the last few weeks. And in John chapter 15, we find Jesus speaking to his disciples, and he's essentially preaching this message to them, to a room filled with grief and sadness and sorrow, because it's believed that this message is spoken at the end of the Last Supper. And so he's preaching this message to these guys, and it's continued discourse. There's not a conversation happening. Jesus is he's speaking directly to them. The chapter before, there's interaction with the disciples, and there's talking. They're having a conversation. There's back and forth. And then we get to John chapter 15, and Jesus is just speaking all the way through. It's completely uninterrupted discourse. He's about to leave them, and he says this in verse 1. He said, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, so that it will be even more fruitful. You're already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Remain in me, and I also in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing." See what's happening in this passage. Jesus is speaking to a group of friends. He's talking to his disciples. They're guys who have committed their lives. They've followed him for the last 3 years. And it's not just that they've followed him. They've committed their lives to him. Prior to this period of knowing Jesus, they held Jewish law. Some of them. They followed this Jewish law that Jesus came to fulfill. Now that Jesus was about to leave them, he was giving a warning of sense because he knew that they would be tempted to return back to the law of Moses. And so he was urging them and encouraging them and imploring them to by faith, adhere to him. That you have to adhere to me. Don't lose sight of me. Without me, you can't accomplish the things that you need to accomplish. Without me, if you go back to this, you'll be lost because we're doing a new thing. See, the struggle that we have to submit to brokenness is not because of necessarily a lack of faith in God, but rather, number one, it's our faith in us is too strong. It's not necessarily that we have a lack of faith in God. It's that we have such a strong faith in what we're capable of doing. And on one sense, it's good. Be strong. Be powerful. Go and accomplish things, right? But faith says that I can do things because of Christ. A lack of faith says I can do things on my own. The Bible is incredibly descriptive about God's feelings towards pride. 58 different times it condemns pride. In Matthew chapter 22, it says, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself." See, pride is disobedience to God's greatest commandment. That we are called to love God first and foremost. To put everything we have into God, and then also love people. Pride can convey many different things. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. I've brought you along, if you've been around, for some of my elementary school basketball ventures, right? My oldest is playing basketball right now. It's her first time, and last week she scored her first points, right? She got 2 baskets, right? She looks at me, and I point to her, right? Because that's what we do. And I point to her, and it was like pure unadulterated pride, right? Like I laughed, I cried, like I'm shaking Shayna, right? We're cheering, and it was crazy. And they go on to win the game. It was like 12-8, right? It felt like the state championship, right? Like I run out on the court, I'm hoisting her up because she had 4 of those points, you know? Like we're at Cowieman and they're playing We Are the Champions. And like, that was all happening in my head. None of this actually happened. There's good pride, right? And then there's the pride that like Isaiah prophesies over. He says this in chapter 13. "I will punish the world for its evil, the wicked for their sins. I will put an end to the arrogance of the haughty, and will humble the pride of the ruthless." There's good pride, and then there's the pride that the Bible warns us over and over and over again. Us having too strong a faith in ourselves and a lack of faith in God, or less faith in God than we have in ourselves, says that God is not in control, that I am in control, that I can do things separate from God because I am better than God. And we don't move forward. We stay stuck where we're at. Or even worse, we take steps back. We digress in our faith. Here's the second thing. We struggle to become broken because we've not yet recognized that there is a need for higher power. We've not yet recognized that there is a need for something bigger than us. And come on, we know that this is church, right? And if you came here today, you probably have some idea that there is a God, potentially that God is big, that God is great, that God is powerful, that he has abilities that we don't have. I don't know where you're at in your faith journey, but we understand when we come to church that there is a God. However, I think that there is this remarkably big difference in us knowing about God and us knowing God. I don't think us knowing about God is us knowing God. I don't think us knowing about God is us knowing God's abilities for our life. I don't think that we can fully grasp God's abilities and care for our life in our head. It has to move to our heart. It has to move to our spirit. To be honest, I don't think that any of us have even really scratched the surface on understanding God, because we still attempt to do things completely by ourselves. That's why Scripture is so crucial, because it's the story of Jesus. And throughout this story, we get this incredible insight of who Jesus actually is. It says this, Paul writes to the Corinthians, he says, even if I should choose to boast, I would not be a fool, because I would be speaking the truth, but I refrain. So no one will think more of me than is warranted by what I do or say, or because of these surpassingly great revelations. Therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. We can't do any of this by ourselves. We can't do any of this adequately by ourselves. And even more so, we weren't called to do any of this by ourselves. We weren't created to do any of this by ourselves. Paul writes that he has a thorn in his side, and he says 3 times he pleaded with God to take it away from him. I've always thought it was interesting that Paul said 3 times. I'm sure that it's an arbitrary number, but the reality is, how many times have we pleaded with God? And we go back and we say, God, I've asked this 1,000,000 times. God, I've asked you 1,000,000 times. Paul says 3, but we always, God, I've asked 1,000,000 times. Why don't you take this away from me? I keep asking and I keep asking, I keep asking. He says, my grace is sufficient. I pleaded with God 1,000,000 times for healing. My grace is sufficient. I pleaded with God 1,000,000 times for financial breakthrough, but my grace is sufficient. Some scholars believe that Paul has an actual physical pain that was hurting him. Some believe that it's a spiritual battle that he's facing. And yet Paul goes to God and he begs him to take it away. And like most of us have experienced, God doesn't do that. There's a different reason. There's a different cause. There's something happening that Paul is not aware of. And then God goes on. About 3 weeks ago in our basketball men's group, I either jammed, severely sprained, or broke my thumb. The jury's still out. I'm giving it a few weeks before I go to a doctor. It's been horrible, right? And needless to say, it was awful. It was very loud when it happened. I've probably milked it pretty hard. As I tend to do. I wanted to die a little bit, though. Unfortunately, since it happened, I've bumped it, I've hit it, I've bent it. Last week, Sloan, my youngest, kicked it, and it popped really loud, and I wanted to die a little. And last night, I got it hooked in my belt loop. And then I had this weird revelation actually in first service that I don't know that I've ever accidentally hooked my healthy thumb in my belt loop, let alone a broken thumb in my belt loop. It was excruciating. To say that I've pleaded with God more than 3 times would be adequate, right? And yet God has refused to take away the pain. He just says, my grace, right? Paul goes on and he continues the second half of this conversation. He says, God, I'm pleading with you over and over and over again, and you've not yet taken this away from me. And God says, my grace is sufficient. He says, my power is made perfect in weakness. And sometimes in the moment, sometimes in the battle, sometimes in the struggle, in the stress, in the trial, we kind of feel like that's a cop-out. I don't think that God cops out, right? I don't think that that's a thing. But sometimes we just want God to do it. And he doesn't do it. He says, my grace is enough. My grace is sufficient. However, my power is made perfect in weakness. The original Greek text, that word perfect means to fulfill or to finish or to take over. There's more behind the text, right? It's not the answer that we want, and yet that's where faith enters in. Faith that says God is going to take over, that he is going to finish it, that he is going to fulfill what he has promised to do. Faith says that his grace is sufficient even when I'm not feeling it. Sometimes we don't feel it. Usually we don't feel it. Faith says that something is happening even when we're not aware that it's happening. How frequently in life are we waiting and waiting and waiting, and we don't feel like anything's happening? And yet God is saying, oh no, there's something happening. You're not aware of it yet, but something is happening. There's something in the works. God is taking over, and he's carrying us through it. We struggle to become broken because we lack an understanding that we need something bigger, that God has the ability to do something bigger. Faith says, in my brokenness, God's glory is made perfect. I want to be broken. Paul says, I boast in my weakness, because in my weakness, God is made perfect. Here's a third thing. Are you still with me? Third thing, we're afraid to sell out. We struggle with brokenness because we're afraid to sell out. We're afraid to completely give ourselves over to God. I did a word search on the internet this week, and I looked up sell out because I was hoping it was going to give me like a really good definition for you. It said in the 90s it was used as a term to, bash on bands who have given themselves over to money. And I'm like, well, that doesn't help. And then I was like, I'll just run with the general understanding. In order for us to sell out, we have to say, okay, God, everything I have is yours. Everything I'm doing is yours. Everything, I'm all in on this. Romans chapter 14 says, for if we live to the Lord. If we die to the Lord. So then, whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. There is no more all-in passage than that. If we live to the Lord. If we die to the Lord. So then, whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. And everything in between. That's both ends of the spectrum. Life and death. In life and in death, we are the Lord's. That's selling out. That's selling out to what God wants from us. But is that the mentality that we live with? We struggle to become broken in our life because we're too afraid to sell out. We're too afraid to go all in. Is that the mentality that we have? I want to have a mentality that says, God, my sole intention in life is for people to see you, not me. When people look at me, I want them to see you, not me. I've got 2 flower pots that I thought I'd share with you today. Funny story, I went to the store to buy these. This is not part of the message. I went to the store to buy these this week, and they stack them like this, and there was all different sizes. So right next to this was the small one, and so I went to pick these up, and I slide it off the shelf, and some joker put the small one underneath, and I pull it off, and it just falls, and I'm like, they're like multiple. I don't know. No, I told them, and then. Lots of half. Anyway, 2 flower pots. One says, can you read that? One says me, one says God. Okay, for illustration purposes, let's just say that this one represents your life, and we'll say that this one represents God. Lack of faith says that I can't sell out to God. Lack of faith says that that even if I get in God and I have this relationship with God, that there's always me being represented. People look at me and they see God. God is there. You can see me. I go to church, right? People may even look at you and say, man, I think that guy loves God. But no matter what, we're not sold out. We're not all in. And so people see a lot of God, but they also see a lot of me. And we go through these struggles and these trials and these storms, and we're like, okay, man, things have been rough this week. I'll make sure I go to church because I think church is going to really bless me, right? And so our life looks like this. And for the most part, that's not that bad. That's mostly God. People look at me and they see mostly God, and yet they're still seeing me in all of this. We want to test the waters so we don't go all in. We just go this much in. And our life looks like this, and we walk through life in this form. Here's the thing about God. God doesn't want partial us. God wants all of us. Revelation 3 says, I know your deeds, that you're neither you're cold nor hot. I wish you were either one or the other. So because you are lukewarm, neither hot nor cold, I'm about to spit you out of my mouth. There are far too many people that can't figure out why faith is not taking in their life. We talk about faith, we push faith, we're saying, man, life can be so much better than this, and they can't figure out why faith is not taking. But the reality is, because this is what our life looks like. People see so much of me when they look at me. It's not about God, it's me. Who's on top? I'm on top. This is my life, and I'm allowing God to be a part of it. But God doesn't need to see me. God doesn't need to see you. Or people don't need to see me. People don't need to see me when they look at me. There is nothing about me that I feel like people need to see. When people look at me, I want them to solely see God. Right? But then there's God and then there's me, and we're separate. So I test the waters, but it's still just mostly God, but a lot of me. People don't need to see me. People don't need to see you. People need to see Him. They need to see Him in you. How do we do that? We get broken, right? We have to be broken. Here's the thing, okay? There's God. Now we're taking ourselves and we fit, and people don't see me. They see God. And granted, I'm in God. God is there, but people don't see me. They see God, right? I'm in God, and people can see it, but people are only seeing God when they look at me. This is what it's about. God uses broken things. In Mark, Jesus goes and he's speaking to 5,000 men, plus women and children, and he needs to feed them. And so a boy shows up with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, and it says that Jesus breaks it and begins dispersing it. Miracles start to happen. In the book of Luke, a woman with an alabaster jar goes to Jesus. It's filled with perfume, and she breaks it. She begins to wash Jesus' feet, and Jesus calls it a beautiful thing. On the night that he was betrayed, he broke bread, and then he begins to set the course for all of humanity. Jesus uses broken things over and over and over again. God uses broken things. The question is, are we willing to be broken? Are we willing to be broken? Are we willing to be broken so that when people look at me, they only see God? I'm in God, but people don't see me anymore. They see God. How do we do it? Number one, we're faithful. We're faithful. If you are not faithful, you are not willing to be used by God. Last week we read a parable that Jesus told about a master who had 3 bags of gold that he gives to his servants. 2 of them came back with this great return on their investment. The master looks at him and he says, well done, good and faithful servant. The cool thing is that he didn't say, well done, good and faithful servant, for listening to 4,373 sermons. He didn't say, well done, good and faithful servant, for attending 7 growth groups this year. Those things are great, but our faith says that God is going to take those things, these things that we're standing on, these things that we've built into our life, and he's going to exceed those things. We have to become faithful so that God will use us to exceed those things. Second thing is that we're available. If you're willing, it means that you are available. It doesn't mean that you have great skill or great talent. It doesn't mean that you have a specific qualification. It simply means that you have a willingness to say, all right, God, here I am. What have you designed for me? I want to be available because God has designed something for me. Here's the third thing. We're humble. We're humble. I said it earlier. Let me loop back around. God resists the proud. God is resistant of the proud. James says that God opposes the proud, but he shows favor to the humble. God opposes the proud, but he gives favor to the humble. As we move into this new season, as you move into this new season for your family or your life or your work or whatever you're looking at, as we move forward as a church in this new season of faith, looking forward at bigger and better things for the kingdom, I want to be on the receiving end of God's favor. James says, God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. I want to be on the receiving end of God's favor. How do we do it? We're humble. We're humble. How do we get there? We continually say, God, this is about you, not me. It's about you, not me. I want to be a part of what God is doing. I want to be on the receiving end of God's favor for my life. I want to be on the receiving end of God's favor for our church, for where we're moving. I want you to be on that receiving end of favor with me. How good would that be? Come on, I pray with you. Jesus, thank you so much.